So, welcome to Fair Housing Fridays, Take Two. I'm Jess Hyman from the Fair Housing Project at CVOEO, and I'm here today with Corinne Yance, also from the Fair Housing Project, and Erhard Mahnke from the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition. Now, we started this new series of Friday webinars last week, and we had a little technical snafu. We had been planning to record it, and it didn't work. And we had a great conversation with about 30 people on the call, a mixture of housing providers, community members, advocates, and others, with great conversation, great questions. We had presentations by Erhard and also by Chris Donnelly from the Champlain Housing Trust. And we're not going to be able to recreate the entire webinar here today, but we wanted to share some of the important points. And we also have documents from Champlain Housing Trust and other resources to share as well. So the series of Fair Housing Fridays is part of Fair Housing Month, which celebrates the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And if you look at the text connected to this video, you'll get some great information about fair housing. And we would like to start with Erhard. And the topic for this Fair Housing Friday is, oh my gosh, Corinne, I've forgotten the name, the topic of our Fair Housing Friday. It is
state and federal policy, housing policy during the COVID-19 crisis. I think we had it more succinct than that, but the theme.
Perfect, thank you. So, Erhard, can you tell us what's happening at the state level in response to COVID-19 and how it affects housing?
Sure, Jess, and thanks for having me, and also the interview we did with Chris last week. It's really too bad that the technology didn't quite work out, but yeah. So our little bit of big picture background first. Our legislature basically kind of went home on Friday, March 13th. It was a Friday the 13th, just about exactly a month ago. And it took them a little while, but they figured out how to meet remotely. And so committees, first from the Senate and then a little later on from the House, figured out how to meet remotely. They each have a YouTube channel, and any of our viewers who are interested in checking in with what's going on with lawmakers while they're not in Montpelier can go on the legislature's website, and which is legislature.vermont.gov, and there's YouTube channels for each of those committees, and you can check in on the legislative schedules. Whichever committee is of interest to you. Housing is covered on the Senate side by Senate Economic Development, and on the House side by House General Housing and Military Affairs. So that's just a little bit of background, and the Senate's actually met a couple times remotely and has actually voted on bills. The House is not quite there yet, but we're hoping that they're going to be there next week. So I just thought maybe a little stage setting there so our viewers can kind of get a picture of, they're doing Zoom conversations just like we're doing right now. That's basically what they've been doing from their living rooms or their basements or their attics or wherever. And so they are busy trying in many, many different ways to formulate a state response to the COVID-19 crisis. In terms of housing, the probably most important response has been that Senate Economic Development and House General have both been working on a bill that became S333, S stands for Senate, which institutes a statewide eviction and mortgage foreclosure moratorium. And before I go into that, I should also hasten to say that the state's Public Utilities Commission also instituted a moratorium on all electric shutoffs from all electric utilities in the state of Vermont. And both the House and the Senate committees And the Public Utilities Commission, I think, recognized early on that in a situation where people need to stay safe by staying home and not getting themselves infected, or not, if they happen to contract the virus, not infect other people that might be especially in a higher risk category, like people over 60 or with underlying healthcare issues. If you're to stay safe at home, it's hard to do that if you're getting evicted. It's hard to do that if your electricity gets shut off. And also another thing that the legislature did, which I can talk about a little bit further on, is they passed, actually both chambers already passed a bill, and the governor signed it, H-681, which among other things also orders all municipalities to enact a moratorium on water and sewer shutoffs. So, obviously if you don't have water and you can't wash your hands frequently, you can't be at home and stay safe at home. So those were, the whole public health emergency really has informed these responses. That you've got to have a home to stay safe in, and you have to have all those amenities, and you can't get evicted. So I'll stop there. I can go more into detail on those, as we go on in the interview.
Erhard, oh, sorry, Jess. Still learning. Erhard, you talked a little bit about the CARES Act, I believe, in our conversation last Friday, and I was wondering if you can expand on how the CARES Act impacts housing in Vermont.
Sure. So great question. While the state legislature, and of course I didn't mention, the executive branch, the Scott administration has been working incredibly hard and overtime on the response. And that is probably, I would say, the primary response in terms of a state response so far. And we could talk a little bit more about that. And I know the materials Chris gave you also describe that a little bit in terms of how Champlain Housing Trust is interfacing with the state on that. But in terms of the federal response, so the federal response has been, there have been 3 bills that Congress has passed and that the president has signed, addressing the COVID-19 emergency. I'm going to focus on the third of the 3, which is known as the CARES Act. And the CARES Act is a $2 trillion relief bill. It's the largest ever. It's larger by a long shot than what was done in the 2008-2009 during the Great Recession to address the economic downturn then, bigger by a long shot. And of course, this economic crisis seems to be deeper than the one that we experienced in 08, 09, because everything has just come to a grinding halt. The CARES Act, in that $2 trillion, there's sort of 3 categories of funding. One is the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is a very broad 1.25 billion is what the state of Vermont is going to receive. It's a $150 billion fund nationwide. And thanks to Senator Leahy, we have what's known as a small state minimum, which means that no state, regardless of how small, will receive less than a certain amount. And for Vermont, that's $1.25 billion, which is a large amount for the state. And it needs to be shared with municipal government, and it cannot be used to kind of backfill all the lost income to the state, the lost taxes, the lost tax revenues. It has to be used specifically to address the COVID-19 crisis. So the next large tranche of funds is categorical funds, which are funds that have a very specific kind of designation, and I'll go to talk about those in a little more detail in a moment. And the third category is assistance to individuals, and in that you have, for instance, the $1,200 that I think most folks have heard about, that every individual up to a certain income level is supposed to receive as a special one-time payment. For couples, it's $2,400 and $500 per dependent child on top of that. And then, of course, unemployment insurance benefits and the major expansion of unemployment insurance benefits is in that category, that individual assistance category. For categorical, which is what we're kind of dealing with in the housing world, is a major, about $12 billion, I think is the overall nationwide number, has been allocated to HUD, the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is one of the major ways of funding housing and homelessness throughout the country. And there's about 7 or 8 different subcategories in the HUD funding, everything from rental assistance to people with Section 8 vouchers, a large increase for that. There's a large increase for project-based vouchers, which are rental assistance vouchers attached to specific units of affordable housing. There's community development block grant funds, which is a very broad, flexible source of block grant funding for the state, and City of Burlington gets its own amount. And then also emergency solutions grants, which are geared much more closely to dealing with the crisis for our homeless population. I'll stop there. See, we can get into further details as you like, yeah, that's sort of the big picture overview. There's certainly other things I could talk about in the CARES Act, like Small Business Administration funding. There's also in that an eviction and foreclosure moratorium for all HUD-funded properties and properties funded by the United States Department of Agriculture's Rural Development Program, and also by a foreclosure moratorium on mortgages that are backed by the United States government through Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or the Federal Housing Administration, Veterans Administration, and so forth. But that's sort of the big picture in terms of housing funding. Of course, there's a lot of human services funding as well for low-income heating and cooling through the LIHEAP program. There's additional funding for our anti-poverty agencies, the 5 community action agencies, through something called Community Services Block Grants, and then also a major boost for childcare funding as well.
Great. Thank you very much. That was a really good overview. So coming back to the eviction moratorium in Vermont, can you share a little bit about what that means for renters and also for property owners and landlords?
Sure. So it's actually, there's a little more background than just the legislative action. Sort of first, what happened was the Vermont Supreme Court issued an administrative order number 49, which basically said that all judicial proceedings, all court proceedings were to be done on an emergency basis. And so what that meant for evictions is that any eviction that was not deemed to be an emergency at the discretion of a Superior Court judge was on hold. However, that didn't really take care of all evictions, because there are things called writs of possession, which is when the sheriff, you've already got an eviction order, and the sheriff comes to your door and says, you have 5 business days. I can't remember the exact number of days. It might be 10. I can't remember. To leave. And if you don't leave by that time, the sheriff comes back and makes sure you leave on the appointed date. So writs of possession were still being issued and executed because they were not subject to the Supreme Court order. And then in addition, 5 Superior Court judges in 5 different counties issued their own orders on writs of possession, but they were writs of possession going forward, and so writs of possession that had previously been ordered were still being carried out. So the legislative moratorium that's wending its way through the process is not as broad as one might have thought originally. And it does still leave the discretion of individual Superior Court judges in cases of emergency. For instance, if you have major criminal activity, if you have illegal drug activity, for instance, someone's cooking meth, there's a meth lab, or if there are acts of violence, or that threaten other other residents, then those are still things that can be taken up for eviction. But eviction due to non-payment of rent, presumably as a result of someone's loss of income, loss of work hours, loss of job as a result of the pandemic, is off the table, as are writs of possession. What that means is, well, what it doesn't mean is that it's not a rent holiday. It doesn't mean you can simply stop paying your rent. If you have the money, if you have the wherewithal, if you're still working, you still have income, you're still receiving, your benefits, you should be paying the rent, especially because, if this lasts, and we don't know how long it's going to last. If it lasts for several months and you're not paying rent, that's going to accumulate. And then there could be, massive number of potential evictions at the back end of this when the emergency plus the 30-day, on some instances, 60-day grace period afterwards expires. It also doesn't mean that a landlord can't file for an eviction. It's just you can go ahead and file for an eviction, and you have to do that through the court system, not by serving an individual. But all of those, and any motion in court to begin an eviction is stayed until 30 days after the emergency is over. So got to keep paying your rent if you have the wherewithal, but if you don't, your landlord can't evict you right now. And of course, that brings up the other issue, which is who's going to pay for all that at the end, because landlords, especially in a state like Vermont, where we have just tons of mom and pop landlords, and full disclosure, we have a rental unit ourselves, so you got to pay the bills. Even if a town, postpones property tax payments the way Burlington is, or is more lenient about abatements, you still have other bills that you got to pay, maintenance bills, water and sewer, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we want to make sure that landlords themselves are the property owners that are making housing available, that they don't wind up in foreclosure themselves. So the other companion issue, and this has not been made clear just yet, is how will the federal government have a fund that helps to pay for people's rent when they are unable to pay it due to a loss of income from COVID-19. Where a lot of people are hoping and expecting that the increase, much more generous unemployment insurance benefits are going to help with that. $600 from the federal government on top of the state's weekly benefits, which Vermont's are better than some other states. That should put a lot of folks in a position to be able to continue paying the rent. But we know that there are going to be gaps. And we also know that there's a lot of folks who don't get rental assistance, that are living on fixed incomes, that are stretched as it is, paying over 50 and 60% of their income for their shelter costs. So how is this all going to be fixed? Well, the CARES Act will take care of anyone on a rent subsidy, whether it's a Section 8 tenant-based or project-based. If they experience a loss of income, they can get their subsidy adjusted, and they should notify their property owner, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit landlord, and their housing authority, just as absolutely soon as possible, so that they can get an interim, what's known as an interim recertification, and they can get their subsidy adjusted to make up for their loss of income. Unfortunately, there is still quite a few. We haven't figured out exactly how many thousands of units, but there are probably several thousand units around the state that are nonprofit, affordable housing developments that don't have those kinds of rent subsidies in them, and so far do not have a federal source for their tenants to be made whole. So one of the things that we propose to the state is, and to the legislature, is that they create a state rental housing relief fund for renters to get additional rental assistance to fill any of the gaps that are left by the federal government. And also, to pay for arrears. So it could either come, upfront through rental assistance, like a Section 8 voucher, or after the fact as a back rent sort of payment to help make, bring the rent up to speed. But that's yet to be determined. And the Senate Economic Development Committee of of the Senate, the Vermont Senate, is they just started taking testimony late last week on what the state needs are, where the holes. Well, first of all, they're trying to understand what the CARES Act does, because it's massive and it's hard to get your hands on, wrap your hands around. So they're still trying to understand that, and then trying to figure out where the gaps are.
Yeah, so Erhard, that was a question that came up more than once in our webinar, that concern around rent forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, when you said earlier, there's been a proposal for a state rent forgiveness program. Is that for nonprofit, like housing nonprofits, or for?
It would be across the board. It would be across the board, and how, again, we have to really parse through the CARES Act, and there's a potential for a second CARES Act, or what would then be a fourth federal relief / stimulus bill that could come later this month or in May. So all that has to be taken into account, because the state's financial situation is really dire. The state is losing tens of millions of dollars worth of revenue as a result of the economic crisis. So obviously, in first order, if there's a federal government solution, we want to look to that first. But yeah, we're advocating for the state to set up, to either take some of the coronavirus relief funds, that $1.25 billion that is really pretty unrestricted, and that is supposed to help address a whole lot of repercussions of the pandemic and the economic crisis that's ensued. We're advocating that either whether it be taken from there or if it be stood up from the state's general fund, but there needs to be a broad-based kind of rental assistance relief fund, ultimately, to fill whatever gaps are left by the federal government, and that could come through the tenants as rental assistance. It would probably be administered by either a housing authority or by local anti-poverty agencies like CVOEO, and then provided as direct assistance to tenants. We do know that there is one source from what we've already been granted, which is those aforementioned CDBG or community development funds, that they allow for up to 3 months of income assistance to people who've experienced a loss of income, and that could be designated as rental assistance or rental arrearage. And so we know that that's available for up to 3 months. And it would be across the board. I'm sorry, what I meant to say also was, this whole kind of grand agreement around a moratorium, an eviction moratorium by the legislature, came as a result of very close work by Vermont Legal Aid, working with the State Landlords Association, the Vermont Apartment Owners Association, as well as one of the lawyers that works for a number of our larger nonprofit housing providers. And they work through just incredible minutia of language around landlord-tenant law and what happens, under certain circumstances during the COVID-19 emergency. And part of the background to that, and one of the reasons that I think, other than this is a public health emergency and we're all in this together, but other than that, one of the reasons that I think made the private sector landlord interests as willing to work on this is the understanding that there is going to be a fund that's going to help them pay the bills, whether it's directly through rental assistance or through some form of assistance to small-time landlords that are experiencing financial difficulties.
So my follow-up question to that, for renters who really want to advocate for rent forgiveness, is there like what avenues would they go through? Who should they be talking to let their voices be heard on that issue?
Well, I would say first off, they should call the governor's office and let the governor know that they've lost income as a result of the pandemic and they can't pay the rent and they need the state to help fill whatever gaps are left by the federal government and the assistance that we're getting from the feds. So they should call the governor's office. They can also, we know that landlords have been calling Housing Commissioner Josh Hanford to let Josh know that they're experiencing difficulties. I think tenants can contact the Department of Housing and Community Development as well. But I think in first order, the phone number that everybody can look up and quite easily is the governor's office. I don't have it right in front of me, but you guys can provide it as one of the follow-ups. And then the other thing is to go online on the legislature's website and find the chairs and the committee members of the Senate Economic Development, Housing, and General Affairs Committee and the House General Housing and Military Affairs Committee. All of the members' emails are listed on the website. Our legislature is incredibly transparent that way. Write them an email, shoot them an email. Or if you don't have access electronically, give them a call. Their contact information is there. They're all home now. They're all, safe, staying home, except for, when they got to go out for all the same things that we all have to go out for, getting groceries, et cetera. So they're all in that same situation. And they're very responsive. They've, from the committee meetings that I've been listening in on, they're getting lots of calls and lots of emails from their constituencies. And I'll also say the President Pro Tem of the Senate, Tim Ash, has a daily briefing at 5:30 every day on Facebook Live, and you can check in with Tim. And as mentioned before, you can also check in on any of the YouTube channels and listen in on. And this is an amazing era of governmental transparency in terms of the legislature, because you don't have to be in Montpelier and sitting in a committee room to listen. You can just dial in on YouTube. It's pretty amazing. But yeah, direct advocacy is best, and of course, people can give their stories to you all, to me, to Chris, folks that that do email on a more frequent basis and are in touch with lawmakers, because we're certainly conduits for people's stories.
Great. Thank you. I think we're really lucky here in Vermont, first of all, to have such a transparent government, but then this crisis is just allowing for more civic engagement and different ways for people to get engaged. And I think these things are going to stick too. I think it's going to be easier for folks to have a voice in all of government now too. So what are some of the other things that came up on Friday's webinar? What questions from the audience are things that you want to make sure that our second viewing audience gets to hear?
One thing that I remember, two things that I remember people asking. One was someone asked about the $1,200 payment, that every individual gets, and what if you're on like Section 8, for instance, if you have a tenant-based voucher, is that going to get counted against you? And my understanding, and we're still reading every day new notices coming from HUD and from various federal agencies giving direction and guidance on this. But my understanding is that that's a one-shot deal and that does not count against you in terms of your ongoing income. By contrast, if you've lost your job and you're applying for unemployment insurance and you're getting perhaps as a result of unemployment insurance and that extra $600, you're actually making more than you are on, normally. Like, let's say you're in retail or, working at McDonald's and you're at a, relatively low dollar an hour wage. It could be that your unemployment benefit could be providing you with greater income. Does that count against you if you're a Section 8 voucher holder? That does. Unemployment insurance is generally considered to be taxable income. It's considered, it counts as income. And so you would actually probably receive a drop in your subsidy. One thing I'm not quite clear on is, whether you have a grace period, because your unemployment insurance might just last, for like a month or 2 months, depending on how long you're unemployed and how long this crisis lasts. There are some guidelines around in HUD with how soon you have to notify your housing authority. I believe there may be a bit of a grace period. So I'm a little unclear about that. But yeah, if you're experiencing an income increase in these times, which more power to you if you are, then you would have to get that. You'd have to get that adjusted, and it could have repercussions for things like Medicaid. It could have repercussions for food stamp benefits as well, which would be obviously somewhat unfortunate, especially in a time of crisis like this. The other thing I remember, and you kind of got into this a little bit, Jess, in terms of the transparency and going forward, and people are starting to think ahead, especially as we're now a month into this crisis, and everybody's been home for a month, and we know we're going to be home for another month based on the governor's recent order, declaring the emergency, extending the emergency to mid-May. People are with the initial sort of emergency response I won't say it's over, but it's certainly subsided a little bit from the hectic aspect of the first couple of weeks when people were moving guests out of homeless shelters and putting them into hotels because they couldn't practice social distancing in a homeless shelter. But that sort of scramble, I would say, of the first couple of weeks is subsided a little bit. And people are starting to think ahead. And how can we use some of these federal dollars that are coming to us and will come to us so that all the folks that are in motels now, and the actually most recent figure I heard this morning is we now have 1,500 people that were formerly living in tents, living in homeless shelters, and a variety of different types of congregate type housing. They're now safe at home in their own motel rooms and are being supported there with food and whatever supportive services they were receiving in the homeless shelter or the domestic violence shelter, they're now receiving in a motel. What happens on June 15th when the governor has said that these motels can start taking tourist reservations after June 15th? Is everybody going to go back to their tents? Are they going to go back to the homeless shelter? Lord knows, we hope not. And this is where we really need to start thinking ahead and figuring out how can we leverage these large amounts of federal dollars that we're getting, not just for rental assistance, but really to deal with the underlying structural issues here, which is that we don't have enough affordable housing to begin with. I mean, that's part of the reason that we have this problem is we don't have enough affordable housing. We don't have enough rental assistance for people who can't pay for market rate housing without some form of economic assistance. And for folks with multiple issues that need wraparound services or some kind of supports to succeed in that housing, we also need sort of what we call the third leg of the affordable housing three-legged stool of investments, which is supportive services. How can we do better and not have people go back into where they came from before they moved into the motels? And clearly we've got to build more housing. We need more rental assistance. Our National Low Income Housing Coalition just came out with an estimate. Nationwide, it's going to take $100 billion worth of rental assistance for everyone who is extremely or very low income, that's cost burden, paying more than 30% of their income for their shelter costs, for them to be able to receive Section 8 style rental assistance, which would stabilize them in housing. And we also need the capital investments to build more housing, because we know that in areas like Chittenden County, where we have a low vacancy rate, even having rental assistance is not necessarily going to do it for you. And there are other areas of the state, like the upper Connecticut River Valley, which is in the same boat. Low vacancy rate. Brattleboro, low vacancy rate. And it's hard to find housing even with a Section 8 voucher. But those are the kinds of things that we need to really start looking for and advocating for. Our regional New England Housing Network just came out with a letter that went out this morning to our congressional delegation with a whole array of advocacy priorities for the next federal stimulus package that can really help to get us out of this mess, because as a nation, we have a nationwide affordable housing crisis, and this public health crisis has just really underscored that in just massive ways.
Thank you, Erhard. That feels like you also covered kind of the big takeaways from Chris's part of the presentation as well. And as we said earlier, we will be sharing that two-page-ish piece that Chris put together that summarizes Champlain Housing Trust's response to the COVID-19 crisis.
Well, great. And
yeah.
I know I sent you guys some links to our National Low-Income Housing Coalition documents that shows what their advocacy agenda is at the federal level, and a few other things that I think would be good resources for for folks that for your viewers. Did we mention also that for folks who want to hear more about the eviction moratorium, this coming Friday, like in 3 days, 4 days here, 3 days, sorry. You're going to have another one of these Fair Housing Fridays with Vermont Legal Aid and Vermont tenants, right?
You're doing my job for me. Why am I even?
I didn't know if you were going to get to that. Sorry, Corinne.
No,
didn't mean to steal your thunder.
Thank you, Eric, for the reminder. Yeah, I was going to say, on Friday, we'll be joined by Legal Aid. So same time as last week, 12:30 to 1:30-ish. We'll try and keep it to 45 minutes, but depending on how long that Q&A takes. So that will be a time for people that have more questions about the eviction moratorium and what that looks like. And, again, there is a really strong interest in the rent forgiveness. And so maybe we can have a longer dialogue with Legal Aid, and our folks from Vermont Tenants will also be in the line as well. So definitely come if you're available. We invite all of our audience to jump on that call. And I just want to reiterate again, we're just so grateful, Erhard, that you could join us for the second try with our technology learning curve here. And also we are, Chris couldn't make it on this second call, but we are grateful that he has been in such close communication with us.
Yeah. I do see that the little red recording light is on, so this one will come out good.
Well, does anyone, Jess, do you have anything to add, or do we feel like we're good?
Yeah, I think we're good. Thank you so much, Erhard, for being here again today. And we're looking forward to seeing everyone this Friday.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate the time and appreciate the opportunity to get the word out.
Okay.
Thanks for what you guys are doing.
Stay safe. Wash those hands.